Some cars are car people cars. They're machines that leave a mark on enthusiasts, but can run largely unnoticed by the lay driver on the street. Others take on a different sort of meaning. Impacted by their pop culture identifiability, the stories of these cars can be rewritten, their memories reshaped. This is one such car, a 1981 DeLorean that's been lovingly crafted into a screen-accurate replica of the Time Machine from your sweaty nephew's favorite film franchise. All of it raises an interesting question though, which is, what exactly are we overlooking beneath all the fun dressing? Today on Driving.ca, we're going to take this Time Machine out on the road. But we're also going to spend some time with an unmodified original. Get in touch with the car's real personality. But we're gonna start off with the one you're probably here for, this here Time Machine. Before you go back to how the original DeLorean drives, it's interesting to know just where the car came from in the first place. You see, the DMC-12 didn't just come out of nowhere. The DeLorean actually was born of a very long and tumultuous development process, and ultimately was brought down by, among other things, a pretty significant drug scandal. The DeLorean Motor Company was started by a man named John Z. DeLorean. DeLorean had previously worked for mainstream automakers, most notably as the head of Chevrolet and a really rather unruly executive all across General Motors. His big claims to fame there are the Chevy Vega, but also importantly, he's the guy who managed to get the Pontiac GTO past the bean counters at General Motors. Back in that day, General Motors insisted on limiting cars' power depending on its overall weight. DeLorean's workaround was to make a normal car and then offer a backdoor GTO package. Though an engineer by trade, he really was a salesman. By helping his dealer network understand the backdoor, he actually managed to get so many Pontiac GTOs out there that GM smartened up and made it a permanent model. In 1973, however, he had bigger ambitions than he could necessarily realize at the General, and so he went on his own. In 1974, he founded the DeLorean Motor Company. The initial concept of the DeLorean was actually rather similar to our home-brewed Bricklin SV1. The original idea, the DeLorean DSV1 for DeLorean Safety Vehicle, was actually an impact bumper, airbag-equipped sports tourer. And more than just that safety orientation, DeLorean had some really interesting ideas about how that car should be built and powered. The original idea for the DeLorean was construction unlike anything the world had ever seen. From early on, John DeLorean wanted to experiment with a new process called elastic reservoir molding. He bought the rights to this process so that he could build the car's entire monocoque from it. And it would have been interesting indeed. The idea was that 2 layers of foam would be pressed together with some resin in the middle. By applying enough force within a mold, this would ultimately compress the foam significantly, causing it to absorb the resin and form a really stiff substrate upon which to assemble the car. It was a cool idea, but it was also an unproven idea, and ultimately it was found to be too expensive in the scale DeLorean wanted, and more than that, not necessarily up to task. To remedy this situation, DeLorean turned to Lotus famed engineer and racer Colin Chapman. Chapman fundamentally re-engineered the bones of the DMC-12. To it, he applied one of his signature backbone chassis, a sort of dog bone steel shape that runs through the center of the car, flaring at the ends. Atop this, Chapman moved to a traditional fiberglass structure upon which he mounted DeLorean's signature and, really important to the DeLorean, stainless steel body panels. Those stainless body panels are also an important engineering innovation, but they aren't quite what you think. You see, stainless steel obviously does not rust, and many people seem to think that as a result, DeLorean body panels don't rust, but the frames beneath certainly still can. In the back of the car too, plans changed quite significantly from the early days. DeLorean's initial plan was to actually use a Wankel or a rotary engine purchased from Citroën to power this thing. That unique power plant would have made it a very high revving and disproportionately powerful by displacement engine. As it turned out, however, Citroën ended up ceasing production of that engine. So the fallback was to be the Ford Cologne V6. But then that didn't pan out either, and so we ended up with this curious and endlessly controversial power plant. The DMC-12 is powered by a PRV 2.8 liter V6 engine. PRV stands for Peugeot, Renault, Volvo. This is not a glamorous power plant. Though fitted to a number of other fast-looking but ultimately slow cars in the era, this engine only put out 130 horsepower and 153 pound-feet of torque. It's a curious engine too. Originally planned as a larger displacement V8, legislative changes caused the group that developed it to actually dial it back to a V6. As a result, it still retains a V8 style 90-degree splay between the cylinder banks and a very unusual for a V6 firing order. It's a weird power plant, and on top of that you get complexity because the PRV is fitted with Bosch CIS mechanical fuel injection. And ask anyone who's had to work on that in any old European car and they will talk your ear off. So then, where do you assemble this strange recipe? Well, Northern Ireland. You see, DeLorean's strong reputation as a force within the industry made his new project particularly attractive for a lot of governments. The DMC plant promised 2,500 to up to 5,000 jobs, and the whole advanced idea behind the car made it a very attractive, future-forward-looking project to invest in, and that investment came quite readily. By approaching the dealer partners that DeLorean had worked with on the GTO, he was able to secure almost 350 investments of $25,000. That's a lot of money back in the 1970s. On top of that, too, he had governments wanting to place those jobs under their jurisdictions. And ultimately, the most compelling bid was to set all of this up near Belfast. Building these complex cars in a time of troubles, mind you, was a bit of a tricky proposition. Interreligious strife in Ireland made constructing these tricky cars even more delicate. Though the DeLorean factory famously employed both Catholics and Protestants in this time of troubles, they still had separate bathrooms and had to manage this powder keg of interpersonal tensions. As if this weren't enough, DeLorean also had to contend with the ballooning costs of the car. You see, the DMC-12 was so named because it was originally supposed to cost just $12,000. In the end, it ended up creeping toward $28,000. That's a lot of money for what was respectable entry-level performance for the day, but not premium Ferrari performance. Equipped with a 5-speed transmission like this car here, the DMC-12 was expected to get to 100 kilometers an hour in just over 10 seconds. That's fine if you're up against a Porsche 924, but it's not exactly impressive. And of course, loaded up as this time machine has, we're not getting anywhere all that fast. But you know, that's okay, because as compromised as this time machine ends up being, it's still quite a delightful car. Even on these backcountry roads, I've already lost counts of the thumbs up and waves that I've had. It brings tangibility to an old nostalgia, and because of the film's broad appeal, one that's really shared by a lot of people. But of course, as that convoluted backstory should have suggested to you, there's a whole lot more here than just the time machine novelty. So then, how does a DeLorean DMC-12 drive as it left the factory? Well, luckily we've got both here, so let's compare. Oh boy, I can breathe again. This is another 1981 DMC-12, but this one has been kept all original. And straight away, I've got to tell you, so many of the myths around this car are misplaced. As I weave it around some of the twisting roads around Milton right now, it's just enough. This is a pleasant way to get around, but still sporting. It's not fast, make no mistake. Those 130 horsepower, those 153 pound-feet of torque are not a lot. And to be sure, there isn't a lot of car here to move either. It's only about 1,200 kilos, which is comparable to my Porsche 944, which has 140 horse. You don't need a lot of power to have fun at this kind of weight. And if anything, actually, this vehicle's dynamics make it rather playful. You see, the DMC-12's mid-rear engine layout means that most of the weight is behind the driver. That means that it's something that you do have to pay a little attention to, because if you lift off in the wrong way or throw its weight around, it may not necessarily react the way a traditionally laid out car will. Though not especially powerful, these are cars that can come around on you on liftoff. With that being said, there's a lot of goodness in that volatility. You see, riding up and down along these country roads, I'm getting to feel a lot of weight transfer on this car's suspension. It's got big mushy tires, it's got a soft setup, and that keeps it comfortable and smooth. That also means that the car shifts. It makes its balance known to the driver. It's communicative. This isn't a car that should surprise a driver with any basic understanding of vehicle dynamics. Indeed, the only thing that should surprise you here is just how satisfying it makes driving with its limited bandwidth. I am rolling heavily into this throttle right now, and I'm not going all that much too fast. This car is one of those things that you can use all of. You can floor it all around and feel like you're going fast without getting into serious trouble. Compounding that, there's a distinct sense of occasion here in this DeLorean. You've got such a unique view outside the car here. This is a cockpit with these tiny toll-paying windows and this wonderfully modern, tidy dash. The slight ruching of the leather keeps it period, but the handling is honestly sort of modern for its era. This wouldn't feel out of place into the early 90s. Of course, it's no NSX, but this is a responsible and composed vehicle. Also pleasing is the manual steering rack here. You see, keeping that weight back there makes it that much easier to steer the fronts. Steering is still a little bit heavy by virtue of the wide front tires, but by and large, this is very tractable and inoffensive. This is a manual rack that you can even dry steer without feeling like you're gonna break something. That can't be said of a lot of cars, let alone with this much front tire. As you can probably read on my face there, one of the big points of satisfaction in here is the sound of that car. That strange V8 splayed PRV behind me is nothing particularly exotic, nor was it in other cars like the Alpine 610. But it's got this really pleasant, almost velvety hum to it. It's a higher frequency sound than many, and being placed right behind your ears with just that bulkhead and glass, a lot of it comes through with a lot of clarity. Run it up through the res even at slow speeds, and you do get a lot of satisfaction out of it. It's a rare quality that is special and largely exclusive to mid-engine cars. Recent highlights that do the same, Porsche Spyder RS, even the new Multimatic built Ford GT. That's good company to be in. Of course, this does not corner nearly as flat as that GT, and honestly, that is probably the most nerve-wracking thing about this car. Is that carrying speed into bends, you know that you can't lift off if you've overcooked it because you'll come around. But as you feel all of that weight lift up and settle to one side or the other, you know that you are playing with a certain set of forces that are not to be trifled with. Now, what about other parts of the drive? Well, touch points, sort of a mixed bag, as is often expected of this era. A lot of the plastics are a little bit creaky, but overall, noise, vibration, and harshness are not too bad in this thing. It's not rattling like the Time Machine with all of its bits. It's pretty well settled and holding together pretty nicely. The gear change on this 5-speed is not the sharpest or sportiest around by any measure, but just like a Lotus, it's right here by the wheel. You can shift up and down without throwing off your groove. The actual feeling of its connection to the gearbox is a little on the soft side, but more in a rubber bushing sort of way than a stretched cable kind of sense. Also a little on the soft side is the clutch. It's not stiff and sporty like some sports cars of the era. If anything, it's actually a little mushy, almost like an unassisted brake pedal. There's a hard pressure through the middle, and it's soft on either side. You don't actually feel a clear-cut engagement or disengagement. You just know that you're doing it right or not. Wrapping all of that softness up then is just the surprising utility of this car. Of course, there are the usual talking points that the gull-wing doors do make them open in a narrower space. But more important here is the fact that there's a lot of cargo capacity in this car. Between the huge space behind the seats and the frunk up there, you've got about 400 liters capacity. For perspective, that's like cramming 10 full-size hiking packs into this car. That's a lot of kit, and between you and your honey, that means that you can show up wherever you need to, dressed in style. Man, it's been a while since I've driven a classic that's left this surprising of an impression, and I am really glad that this DeLorean has come through so brightly. There's a lot of negativity going around about these cars, and spending some time with it, even beyond the rose-tinted glasses of classic car enthusiasm, there's just a lot of general goodness to appreciate. Throttle back your high performance expectations and give these cars a chance beyond just their time machine rep, and you'll find that there's so much more here to respect. If anything then, the least satisfying thing about this drive experience for me now is just all of the attention it gets. It pulls so many eyeballs, and if you're into that, more power to you. But for me, I prefer classics that pull a little less attention. I'm fine with just a select few knowing what I'm driving. And for those enthusiastic few to come and chat about all of the neat things about those cars. So then, is the DeLorean a great car? Well, not necessarily, but it doesn't need to be. This is a car that exists in a class largely of its own. It's a car that offers so much stimulation, so much curiosity, and so much excitement and satisfaction for drivers and the people around them that it gets away with just being itself. The DeLorean is a little bit goofy, it's a lot quirky, and it does all of that with a really refreshing confidence. It just is, and you know what? More power to you, DMC-12. This is a charming vehicle. So with all of this laid out, the DeLorean is a properly enjoyable car and one that's worth far more attention than it gets simply as a film prop. This is a very interesting classic. This is a car that drives rather unlike most anything else of its era. This is a comfortable, surprisingly usable car, and it's one that brings smiles to so many faces. This is a car that deserves a lot more respect than it's received. For Driving.ca, I'm Mel Alder. For more classic car drives, fun, and all the rest, be sure to follow us online on Driving.ca and check out our socials over on Instagram and Twitter.
Oh, good. I'll take your mic. Is that the car from the movie?